Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. So in this episode I'm going to be exploring, and I've been doing a lot of research at the method or the mechanics of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Was it the Urim and Thummim, or the Nephite interpreters, or the spectacles as they're referred to, or was it Joseph Smith putting his seer stone in a hat, putting his face in the hat, and then reading the words as the spiritual light did shine? I did do a video on the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, of the gold plates, and my position whenever I first started my series on the Book of Mormon is that there's so many sources that speak of Joseph Smith using a seer stone, and there's some statements from David Whitmer, Emma Smith, Martin Harris that referred to the Urim and Thummim being used during the 116 pages, and then for convenience Joseph Smith switching to use his seer stone. However, I find after reading the book and my interview with Jonathan Neville and James Lucas and their book By the Means of the Urim and Thummim, they definitely push back on this seer stone narrative, providing lots of sources and statements, first-hand statements from Joseph Smith, who was either the translator or, if you believe naturalistically, the author of the Book of Mormon. Oliver Cowdery was the principal scribe after the loss of the 116 pages, and John Whitmer as well, and other statements that refer to the means being the Urim and Thummim, or the Nephite interpreters, pushing back on the seer stone accounts. So I've done a lot of research and I've read through a lot of the sources I could find, a lot of it coming from the book Opening the Heavens. What I am going to be doing in this episode is I'm going to be compiling and just reading a lot of the sources and statements given by people on the Book of Mormon translation, primarily the eyewitnesses. So we'll be looking at Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Emma Smith, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, people like John Whitmer as well, Joseph Knight Sr., Elizabeth Cowdery, Michael Morse, Joseph Knight Sr. We'll also look at maybe some like newspaper accounts or like secondhand accounts as well. Can't say that I've read through every single account I could find, and there are some which I found a little bit repetitive. So for this sake, I've not included every single source, but there's probably a good 100 or so in here, which I have, which specifically talk about the method or means of translation. At the end of my Book of Mormon series, I sort of gave my final thoughts on the nature of the translation, and I lean more towards it being a functional translation, that it wasn't literal, word for word, or inerrant, and that it wasn't coming from God onto the stone or the spectacles, but the understanding and the meaning of the plates was being transmitted through the translation instrument, but that it was very much Joseph Smith as the translator in his translation providing a meaning and a functionally sufficient translation, but that the language reflects Joseph Smith's 19th century language, vocabulary, helping us to make sense of why there are King James Bible passages and errors, language sounding similar to what you would have heard at revivals, or other Methodists having their conversion experiences, some of the poor grammar, even some of the anachronisms, being a 19th century translation of an ancient text, and that Joseph Smith was very much involved in the translation process. Other reasons why I lean that way is Doctrine and Covenants 9, when Oliver fails to translate and the Lord says you must study it out in your mind and then ask me if it be right, implying that the translation process perhaps required more intellectual work, and Joseph having to close the translation rather than just reading the words. And whether or not you believe it was God revealing the words of the translation on the instrument in just Joseph's 19th century language and vocabulary, that could also be true. It could still also be a tight translation. I lean more towards that probably wasn't the case, although I think Joseph was reading words. I believe it was his words in his language, because I struggle how could Joseph Smith justify then making changes, even small changes, to grammar, changing supposed errors or clarifying some things, if it was God's translation. But if it was Joseph translating but through the gift and power of God, I could understand him not viewing it as inerrant. So that was sort of like my view, my take on Book of Mormon translation, but I didn't really give my final thoughts on seer stone versus the Urim and Thummim, and my sort of position is that there's lots of sources that state that it was by the means of the Nephite interpreters. There's others that speak about the seer stone. I felt like probably both were used throughout the translation, but it's difficult to determine which was used when. So this video is going to be looking at all the sources in part 1, and then part 2 I'll be looking at more of an analysis and what people like Jonathan Neville, James Lucas have to say, and scholars like Jerry Dirkma or Michael McKay. So bear with me, and I will be including at the very end of the video pages where you can find the full sources, but for the sake of time, it just took too much time to copy out all the quotes and then to also include the sources and the references. So I've just taken pictures and you can look at them at the end. Okay, so let's dive in. Was it the Urim and Thummim versus the Seer Stone? Let's look at the accounts of different people. So we're going to start with Joseph Smith and what he had to say about the translation. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it just talks about Joseph being given the power to translate the gold plates by the means of the Urim and Thummim. Joseph Smith's statements on the translation coming forth of the Book of Mormon in 1830, Joseph Smith said this in the preface to the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, I translated by the gift and power of God. In an 1831 Elders Conference, this was recorded by Oliver Cowdery, Brother Joseph said it wasn't intended to tell the world all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and said that it was not expedient for him to relate these things. And that's often quoted, I think that's quoted in the Church's Gospel Topics essay, but actually Joseph gave a number of other statements about the means of translation. As recorded by Nancy Towle in 1832, Joseph speaks about being contained with the plates a pair of interpreters, as he called them, that resembled spectacles, by looking into which he could read a writing engraven upon the plates. Joseph Smith was interviewed by Peter Bodder in 1834, and he says, by the aid of the glass, which he also obtained with the plates, by which means he was enabled to translate the characters on the plates into English. Joseph Smith, as recorded by Oliver Cowdery, says that to obtain and translate by the means of the Urim and Thummim, which were deposited for that purpose of the record. In 1836, this was written by Truman Coe, Joseph Smith said, by putting his finger on one of the characters and imploring divine aid, then looking through the Urim and Thummim, he would see the import written in plain English on a screen placed before him. He would again proceed in the same manner and obtain the meaning of the next character. Joseph Smith, in his 1838 history, says, I obtained them, and by the means of the Urim and Thummim, with them, by means of which I translated the plates, and thus came the Book of Mormon. In 1839, in Joseph Smith's history, he talks about receiving 2 stones in silver bows, these being fastened to a breastplate, which constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim, that they were deposited with the plates, and the possession and use of these stones, God had prepared them for the purpose of translating the book. Immediately after my arrival, I commenced copying the characters of the plates. I copied a considerable number of them, and by means translated them. Joseph Smith, in the 1842 Wentworth letter, said, with the records was found a curious instrument, which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones fastened to a breastplate. Through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. Okay, so brief summary of Joseph's statements on the Book of Mormon. He talks about that it was by the gift and power of God, and that he translated using the Urim and Thummim, or the Nephite interpreters, which were deposited with the plates. Joseph doesn't specify exactly the method or the mode of translation, except for the account by Truman Coe. They would put his finger on one of the characters, pray or implore for divine help, and then look through the Urim and Thummim and see in plain English the translation, implying that in this source, the Urim and Thummim was used with the plates. To be very consistent, Urim and Thummim, which was contained and deposited with the plates, and there's no mention of a seer stone in a hat. So Oliver Cowdery, who's the main principal scribe, says, day after day, I continued uninterrupted to write from his mouth as he translated from the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites would have said, interpreters. He says, I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon. This was recorded in 1848 by Reuben Miller, as it fell from the lips of the prophet, as he translated by the gift and power of God, by the means of the Urim and Thummim, or as it is called by that book, holy interpreters. Oliver Cowdery was interviewed by Josiah Jones in 1834, and says that Joseph Smith Jr. had translated it by looking into a stone or 2 stones. So that's a bit ambiguous. Is he referring to maybe the seer stone is 1 stone, or is he referring to taking out one of the stones of the spectacles? I don't know. When put into a dark place, which stones he said were found in a box with plates. Interesting, when it says put in a dark place, does that mean putting it into a hat? While he looked through the stone spectacles, Smith looked into or through transparent stones to translate what was on the plates. Oliver Cowdery as interviewed by Samuel Whitney Richards, and I didn't write the date for this source, but it was published in 1907, so it was quite late. I'm not actually sure what date the interview was conducted, but he says, Oliver Cowdery, represents Joseph Smith as sitting by the table with the plates before him, he reading the record with the Urim and Thummim. This is done by holding the translators over the words of the written record, and the translation appears distinctly in the instrument. So, summary of Oliver's statement on the Book of Mormon translation. His statements refer to him talking about the method of translation being the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters. Again, like Joseph doesn't speak about a seer stone in a hat. There's one source that says that the Urim and Thummim was used with the gold plates, but it is also a late account. I'm not sure when the interview was conducted. No, I couldn't find a date that was given for when the interview was done. Obviously, I'm guessing it was done when Oliver was alive, but it's many years later it was written. Okay, Emma Smith, who was the wife of the prophet and also a scribe during the initial translation of the 116 pages, and maybe did a little bit of translation before Oliver Cowdery came on the scene. In a 1870 letter, she says the first part of my husband translated was translated by the use of the Urim and Thummim, that it was the part that Martin Harris lost. After that, he used a small stone, not exactly black, but was rather a dark color. This is an interview by her son, Joseph Smith III, Emma's sort of final testimony. And she says, I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting by the table close by him. He's sitting with his face buried in his hat, with a stone in it, and dictating hour after hour with nothing between us. The plates often lay on the table without any attempt of concealment. So in Emma's letter that she wrote in 1870 to, I think it was Emma Pilgrim, she talks about the Urim and Thummim being used during the 116 pages, but then after the last 116 pages, then Joe Smith used the seer stone. And according to her interview with her son, Joe Smith III, her being an eyewitness and a scribe to Joseph, as he dictated for hours before, that he would put the seer stone in the hat and his face in the hat, and then she would write down the words, and that the plates were often on a table, but they were wrapped. Martin Harris, who was the main scribe during the 116 pages, we're going to read some of his accounts. So when he was interviewed by John Clark, he talks about a thick curtain or blanket was suspended between them. Smith lay behind the blanket, pretended to look through his spectacles or transparent stones, and would then write down what he saw. Harris would write down, sat on the other side of the blanket. This interview was done in 1840. So here Martin Harris is talking about a blanket or a curtain separating him and Joseph and being done through the spectacles or the Urim and Thummim. Martin Harris was interviewed by the Iowa State Register in 1870, and he says that there is also found with the chest the Urim and Thummim, by means of which the writing upon the plates was translated. By means of the Urim and Thummim, a large pair of spectacles, as Mr. Harris termed them, the translation was made, and Mr. Harris claims to have written. So in 1881, Edward Stevenson, so this is secondhand, writes that the prophet Joseph Smith, he said, so this is Martin Harris, that he possessed a seer stone by which he was enabled to translate as well as the Urim and Thummim, and for convenience, he then used the seer stone. Interesting, so he's saying that Joe Smith could translate using the Urim and Thummim, but that for convenience sometimes used the seer stone. Martin explained the translation as follows. By aid of the seer stone, sentences would appear and were read by the prophet. Martin said the seer stone differed in appearance entirely from the Urim and Thummim that was obtained with the plates, which were two clear stones set in two rims, very much resembled spectacles. And he gave a similar statement by Andrew Jensen, 1887, and it's in this 1886 statement to Edward Stevenson where he talks about the stone swapping story, where Martin finds a similar looking stone, and because people were saying that Joseph is just reciting sentences texts that he'd already learned, Martin found a similar looking stone when they went out and they were skipping rocks, put that stone in the hat, and then Joseph was unable to translate, implying that even during the translation of the 116 pages, Joseph was using a seer stone, as well as the Urim and Thummim. Other interviews from Martin Harris says that I also wrote for him the first part of the translation as he interpreted them by the Urim and Thummim. He saw Joseph Smith translate the Book of Mormon with his peepstone in his hat. Sometimes the plates would be on the table in the room in which Joseph was translating, covered with a cloth, so similar to Emma's statement about the plate sometimes being covered with a cloth. On the 14th day of June, 1828, Joseph dictated to me from the plates of gold, as the characters thereon assumed through the Urim and Thummim. So, Martin Harris, summary of his statements, he was a scribe during the Book of Mormon translation of the 116 pages. Some sources from Martin speak of there being a curtain, that interview with John Clark, separating him and Joseph. And some of his statements speak of Joseph translating by using the Urim and Thummim or the spectacles. But there's also a couple of sources that talk about Joseph using a seer stone, and that quite elaborate one to Edward Stevenson, that for convenience, Joseph would sometimes use a seer stone instead of the Urim and Thummim. And we have the story of swapping the stone. So David Whitmer, he's the one that gives the most statements on the translation of the Book of Mormon. And the last portion of the Book of Mormon was translated in the Whitmer home. It was initially translated in Harmony, Pennsylvania, but then they moved, I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's like the beginning of June. So as interviewed by Thomas Wood Smith in 1879, Whitmer says he saw Joseph translate by the aid of the Urim and Thummim time and time again, the translation being read by the Urim and Thummim of the characters on the plates by Joseph Smith. Now, I don't know if Whitmer is referring to the Urim and Thummim, because some people later referred to a seer stone as also a Urim and Thummim, if he's meaning the Nephite interpreters or if he's meaning the seer stone in this account. He was also interviewed in 1879, where this kind of contradicts the Urim and Thummim statement. I never heard him say that the translation was made by aid of the Urim and Thummim, but in every case he declared Joseph first offered prayer and then took a dark-colored opaque stone called a seer stone, placed it in the crown of his hat, then put his face in the hat and read the translation as it appeared before him. This was the daily method of procedure. And he says a considerable portion of the work of translation was performed in a room of his father's house, where he then resided. There can be no doubt but Father Whitmer is a competent witness of the manner of translating. Okay, so this is the seer stone in the hat narrative, and that he witnessed this as a daily method of procedure. David Whitmer in 1880, interviewed by Thomas Wood Smith, he said the translation was done by aid of the Urim and Thummim. An interview by Ari B. Mullen said that Joseph had the instrument Urim and Thummim. I asked him how they looked. He said they looked like spectacles, and he, Joseph, would put them on and look in a hat or put his face in the hat and read. It's interesting, he's talking about, in these two statements, these two interviews, the Urim and Thummim, but he's putting the spectacles on, but then would put his face in the hat. In an interview by the Kansas City Journal in 1881, he has to say he had two small stones of a chocolate color, nearly egg-shaped and perfectly smooth, but not transparent, called interpreters, which were given him with the plates. I wonder if there's conflation here, because all other accounts of the Urim and Thummim is that they were two like transparent looking stones, but he's now saying they were two egg-shaped chocolate stones, but it was Joseph Smith's seer stone, which is sort of shaped like an egg in a chocolate color. But anyway, he says he did not use the plates in the translation, but would hold the interpreters to his eyes, cover his face with the hat, excluding all light, and before his eyes would appear what seemed to be parchment, on which would appear the characters of the plates in a line at the top, and immediately below would appear the translation in English. So I think there's a bit of a conflation of the description of the interpreters in this account, but this again is saying that it was the interpreters put in a hat. This is a first-hand statement given by David Whitmer in 1881. He says, I did not say that Smith used two small stones, as stated, nor did I call the stone interpreters. So he's responding to this past interview. I stated that he used one stone, not two. The interpreters were, as I understood, taken from Smith and were not used by him after the losing of the first 116 pages. It is my understanding that the stone referred to was furnished him when he commenced translating again after losing the 116 pages. My statement was, and now, is that in translating, he put the stone in a hat, putting his face in his hat, so as to exclude the light, and that then the light and in characters appeared in that hat together with the interpretation. So he seems to be responding to that previous interviews. He's saying, no, I never said it was the interpreters, but Joseph Smith would put the seer stone in the hat. It was his understanding that he lost the Urim and Thummim with the interpreters after the loss of 116 pages. And obviously, his account of the Urim and Thummim not being used after the 116 pages and claiming it was done just by a seer stone in the hat obviously conflicts with what Joseph and Oliver and their statements of the translation. But we'll talk more about that in part 2. When interviewed by the Chicago Times in 1881, he says the plates were translated by Smith, who used a small oval kidney-shaped stone called Urim and Thummim. But he's referring to a single stone, so it seems like David Whitmer is calling that stone a Urim and Thummim, but he's referring to the single stone. He also says that Smith had no manuscript, notes, or other means of knowledge save the seer stone and the characters as shown on the plates, being present and cognizant of how it was done. So he claims that he was present, he was there. All other witnesses are quite unanimous that there was no notes or manuscript or book open that Joseph was using, just the translation instruments. When he was interviewed by James H. Hart in 1884, he says the way it was done was thus. Joseph would place the seer stone into a hat, placing his face close to it, and he would see not the stone, but what appeared as an oblong piece of parchment, on which the translation of the hieroglyphics would appear, and also the translation in the English language. In an 1884 interview by George Q. Cannon, he says that Joseph had the stone in a hat from which all light was excluded. So he's very much referring to the stone in the hat method of translation. Okay, he was interviewed by the St. Louis Republican in 1884. He says, in translating from the plates, Joe Smith looked through the Urim and Thummim, consisting of two transparent pebbles set in the rim of a bow, fastened to a breastplate. He dictated through them to his scribes. So now David Whitmer is now saying it was the Urim and Thummim, which was fine with the plates, but earlier saying no, it was just the seer stone. In his interview with Zenas H. Gurley, he says, he used a stone called a seer stone, the interpreters having been taken away because of transgression. The interpreters were taken from Joseph after the loss of the 116 pages. So it's like you read one interview and he's saying, no, it was the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters. And then another statement where he's saying, no, the interpreters were taken away after the 116 pages and it was just the seer stone. Dale Whitmer in the Chicago Tribune in 1885 says that the translation was performed in the presence of not only the person mentioned, but of the entire Whitmer household and several of Smith's relatives besides. He says after affixing the magical spectacles to his eyes, Smith would take the plates and translate the characters one at a time. The graven characters would appear in succession to the seer, and directly under the character when viewed through the glasses would be the translation in English. So this account isn't only just referring to the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters, but that he would actually look at the characters on the plates in translation, totally conflicting some of David Whitmer's earlier statements. He also goes on to say, the plates, however, were not returned, but instead Smith was given by the angel a Urim and Thummim of another form. The seer stone he was instructed to place in his hat, and on covering his face with the hat, the character in translation would appear on the stone. 1886 Omaha Herald said, the Urim and Thummim, in the strange process of translation, that after the loss of the 116 pages, the Lord took from him the Urim and Thummim. The prophet was prevented, I think I should say presented, I don't know if I've mistyped, a strange oval-shaped chocolate-colored stone about the size of an egg. It was promised should serve the same purpose as the Urim and Thummim. With this stone, all of the present Book of Mormon was translated. Okay, so in this account, this is almost supporting Emma's statement that after the loss of 116 pages, that Joseph was then given a seer stone, but I believe Joseph Smith obtained that seer stone in 1822. When he was digging a well on Josiah Stoll's property, but this account is saying that he received it from the angel. 1886, M.J. Hubble interview, he said Smith translated by the means of a pair of large spectacles. Firsthand, David Whitmer in 1887, he says, I am an eyewitness to the translation of the greater part of the Book of Mormon. Part of it was translated in my father's house in Fayette. Joseph Smith put the seer stone into a hat, put his face in a hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. 1888, this is recorded by the Richmond Democrat. He says Smith would put on the spectacles when a few words of the text of the Book of Mormon would appear. After the loss of the 116 pages, Smith again found favor with the Lord and was presented with an oval-shaped stone. An interview by Tanner, Nathan A. Tanner, in 1909. I don't know if the interview was conducted in 1909 or this is when it was published. He says, David Whitmer, said that Joseph was separated from the scribe by a blanket, and as I remember, he had the Urim and Thummim and a chocolate-colored seer stone, which he used alternately as suited his convenience. And he said that he believed Joseph could as well accomplish the translation by looking into the hat or any other seer stone by the use of the Urim and Thummim or the chocolate-colored seer stone. So Whitmer's description, there was a lot of sources there, and there's a lot of conflicting statements. Some sources support Joseph Smith translating by the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters. There's quite a lot that refer to the seer stone in a hat. His two first-hand statements coming from himself are adamant that it was the seer stone in the hat. Some sources say that he believes that Urim and Thummim were lost after the 116 pages. But then some of the interviews conducted, they're referring to either the Nephite interpreters or the seer stone. So it's whether or not David Whitmer is just giving conflicting accounts of the Book of Mormon translation, or if they're not accurately reporting what David Whitmer said. Although David Whitmer was not a scribe, he claims to have been an eyewitness during the very end part of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Okay, we're going to look at just some what other people have to say about the Book of Mormon translation. Some of these people are eyewitnesses, or they're people who were told about it. So they may be writing secondhand, newspaper accounts, even what critics have to say. So John Whitmer, so he was a scribe actually for the part of the Book of Mormon translation in the Whitmer home. An 1879 interview with Zenas H. Gurley says, when the work of translation was going on, he sat at one table with his writing material, and Joseph at another with the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim. The latter were attached to the breastplate, and were two crystals or glasses, into which he looked and saw the words of the book. Interesting, he's referring to the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim. Not many accounts talk about that. Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith talk about Joseph having spectacles and translating the characters on the gold plates. Lucy says he showed him also the Urim and Thummim, by which he might understand the meaning of the inscriptions on the plates. And Lucy actually also gives a good sort of description, claiming to have felt the Urim and Thummim as well, so being a witness of that. William Smith in 1883 and 1884 says, he translated them by means of the Urim and Thummim, the manner in which this was done by looking into the Urim and Thummim, which was placed in a hat to exclude the light. Okay, so now he's saying Urim and Thummim in a hat. When Joseph received the plates, he received the Urim and Thummim, which he would place in a hat to exclude all light. Now, I don't know if William Smith was really an eyewitness, but obviously a family member of the prophet. He is just relating what he believes is what occurred during the Book of Mormon translation. Elizabeth Cowdery, who is a sister of the Whitmers and married Oliver Cowdery, says, I cheerily certify that I was familiar with the manner of Joseph Smith's translating the Book of Mormon. He translated the most of it at my father's house, and I often sat by and saw and heard them translate and write for hours together. Joseph never had a curtain drawn between him and his scribe while he was translating. So the descriptions of a curtain being drawn up, there is that source from Martin Harris that occurred in the 116 pages, but she's saying, no, that didn't occur between Oliver and Joseph when they were at my father's house. So Joseph never had a curtain drawn between him and his scribe while he was translating. He would place the director in his hat. I don't know if she's referring to the seer stone or the spectacles when she says director. It's a bit ambiguous to me. Then place his face in his hat so as to exclude the light, and then read the words as appeared before him. Okay, so that's very consistent with David Whitmer's stone in a hat method of translating. Isaac Hale, so a father of Emma, antagonistic towards Joseph, but they lived on Isaac Hale's land, their property, so he claims to be an eyewitness. He says the manner in which he pretended to read and interpret was the same as when he looked for the money diggers, with the stone in his hat and his hat over his face, while the book of plates were at the same time hid in the woods. Michael Morse, is recorded by W. Blair in 1879, says, when Joseph was translating the Book of Mormon, he, Morse, had occasion more than once to go into his immediate presence, saw him engaged at his work of translation. So this is being recorded by W. Blair, Michael Morse claiming to be an eyewitness. He says the mode of procedure consisted in Joseph placing his seer stone in the crown of his hat, putting his face into the hat so as to entirely cover his face, resting his elbows upon his knees, and then dictating word after word while the scribes, Emma, Oliver, or John Whitmer, wrote it down. And he's actually quite accurate in relating who were the scribes of the Book of Mormon. Hiel and Joseph Lewis, I believe they were cousins of Emma. Smith translated the Book of Mormon by means of the same peepstone. It is a fact that he translated nearly all of his Golden Bible with his same stone in the hat. John H. Gilbert to James D. Combe wrote in 1879, with the plates was a large pair of spectacles, by looking through which Joe could translate the hieroglyphics on the plates into English. Joseph Knight Sr., who was an early convert and a friend of the Smiths, said the way he translated was he put the Urim and Thummim into his hat, darkened his eyes, then he would take a sentence, and it would appear in bright Roman letters. When he refers to Urim and Thummim, I don't know if he's claiming that he was an eyewitness, and he also doesn't distinguish between, is it the Urim and Thummim that was with the plates, the Nephite interpreters, or is he referring to the seer stone? Rochester Advertiser and Telegraph in 1829, so it's very contemporary, says, by placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into it, Smith could, he said so at least, interpret these characters. And this is the one by Jonathan Hadley. And what I find very interesting about this account, which we'll talk more about in part 2, is that it's a very accurate account of how the Book of Mormon came forth, the description and dimensions of the plates. So this seems to me like quite a credible source. Critic Alexander Campbell in 1832 says the prophet, through his stone spectacles, made a translation through the stone spectacles in a dark room, and in the hat the prophet Joseph Smith from the Reformed Egyptian. E.D. Howe in 1834, this is from Mormonism Unveiled, says, now whether the two methods for translating, one by a pair of stone spectacles set in the rims of a bow, and the other by one stone, we are informed that Smith used a stone in a hat for the purpose of translating the plates. So this is actually quite interesting that it refers to both methods being used here in 1834. The Evening and Morning Star in 1833 says the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, by an unlearned man through the aid of a pair of interpreters or spectacles. Henry Harris in 1833 says, when he asks Joseph what letters were engraved on them, he said he could not understand the words, that he was the person that must translate them, and on looking through the stone was unable to translate. Christian Journal in 1835 says that he was inspired to interpret the writing or engraving by putting a plate in his hat, putting two smooth flat stones which he found in the box in the hat, and putting his face therein. He's talking about in this account putting both the plates and the Urim and Thummim in the hat. This source I see as an outlier, and I take it with a pinch of salt. John Carl in 1839 said that Smith was commanded to translate them himself, by which he did by the help of what he calls the Urim and Thummim, two stones set in a bow. Charles Anton, who was one of the scholars that Martin Harris visited, bringing some of the characters supposedly from the plates, he writes in a letter in 1841, along with the Golden Book, there have been dug up a very large pair of spectacles, so he's obviously getting this from Martin Harris, enabling anyone who looked through them not only to decipher the characters, but also to comprehend their exact meaning, and be able to translate them. Pomeroy Tucker in 1867 says, with the book was also found a huge pair of spectacles, or the Urim and Thummim, and that Joseph translated by which. Sidney Rigdon in 1876, so he was a convert, he wasn't a witness to the Book of Mormon translation, but he says he was told that Joseph, when he put on the spectacles, took the gold plates one by one, and it was a literal translation of the writing upon the gold plates. So that's what obviously he was told about the translation of the Book of Mormon. Right, so that finishes off looking at a lot of the accounts. I've just sort of like tallied up from all these sources I've looked at, the proportion of the sources which refer to the Urim and Thummim, the proportion of sources that refer to the Urim and Thummim with the gold plates, the proportion that refer to the spectacles or Nephite interpreters, but like in a hat, those that refer to the seer stone in a hat, and those that refer to either the Urim and Thummim and the seer stone, or the Urim and Thummim during the 116 pages, and then the seer stone. And by no means am I saying that the one that has like the most sources means that's the method of translation. And obviously those given by the eyewitnesses should bear more weight than those given by people who are only hearing secondhand. It was just helpful for me to see, okay, what is everyone saying? So I made this little chart. So with Joseph Smith, there are 6 sources that refer to translating by the Urim and Thummim, 1 with the Urim and Thummim and the plates. With Oliver Cowdery, 3 with the Urim and Thummim, 1 with the Urim and Thummim and the plates. Emma Smith, 1 referring to the seer stone in the hat. That was the interview, her final testimony by Joseph Smith III. 1 with then the Urim and Thummim and then the seer stone. With Martin Harris, there was 4 sources referring to the Urim and Thummim, 1 referring to a seer stone in the hat, and 1 a Urim and Thummim, then seer stone. David Whitmer, there was 5 sources I found stating it was by the Urim and Thummim, 1 the Urim and Thummim with the plates, 7 talking about a seer stone in a hat, and 5 talking about the Urim and Thummim, and then after the last 116 pages, he used a seer stone. John Whitmer refers to the Urim and Thummim with the plates. Lucy and Joseph Sr. both refer to the Urim and Thummim. William Smith refers to the spectacles, or Urim and Thummim, in a hat. Joseph Knight Sr. and Elizabeth Cowdery, I don't know if they're referring to either the spectacles in a hat or a seer stone in a hat. Isaac Hale, Joseph Hale Lewis, and Michael Morse refer to the seer stone in a hat. Other newspapers, critics, or second-hand accounts, there was 5 I found referring to Urim and Thummim, 2 Urim and Thummim with the plates, 2 spectacles in a hat, and 1 referring to the Urim and Thummim and then a seer stone. So 25 sources in total referring to the Urim and Thummim, 6 Urim and Thummim with the plates, 3 to 5 with spectacles in a hat, 13 to 15 with the seer stone in a hat, and 8 referring to the Urim and Thummim and then the seer stone. Okay, so that kind of finishes off all the sources. Part 2 is going to be more of an analysis and looking at what different historians and researchers have to say. I think there's some consistency that it was either the Urim and Thummim or the seer stone that was used in the translation, but there's also a lot of conflicting statements. Some people referring to it was by means of the Nephite interpreters, some saying it was the Nephite interpreters over the gold plates, others saying it was the Nephite interpreters put in the hat, quite a few referring to a seer stone in the hat, and some saying it was the Nephite interpreters up until the loss of the 116 pages, but then after it was the seer stone. And there's no way that all of these can be right. And of course, because there's so many people recording statements and there's interviews, there's going to be some errors. But this, for me, looking actually at all the sources, it makes me realize that trying to piece together historically what actually happened, while there is a lot of consistency, there's also a lot of conflicts. And we'll be getting into that more in part 2. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If there's any key or important sources that I've missed out, then please let me know, leave a comment, or send me a message or an email. So that sums up today's video. I'm going to put some of the sources on at the end of the video. And based on all the sources I've presented, my analysis, give me what your thoughts are. But part 2 will be diving into more of analysis on what different people have to say. So definitely come back and watch part 2. Thanks so much for watching. Take care and bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.